name's Brian Garvey. I'm from a little bit further west of Scotland than here. I grew up just in a place called Armagh, not far across the sea. Lived in Portaferry for a while. I know there's some fishermen here, so we're used to some of the boats coming and going between Scotland and Ireland. So it's great to be back here. We were here last year with a group of visitors from the Brazilian Amazon. So Maria lives in Dunvegan, who's a young woman and a young mother with a price on her head since 2015. She's been living under death threat. When she goes back from her visit here, she goes back. She's only able to take public transport. She has to go by kind of private boat and bus back to her Aldea that was attacked just a few years ago. So when she was in the Isle of Skye last year, it was quite emotive because it was just 1 year after her Aldea, or her indigenous community, had been attacked and burned by illegal miners. So she was one of the leading voices of the Amazon women, and Manduraku women have been to the fore of that struggle for their rights, for their territory, and for their own human rights, as well as the existence of the Amazon rainforest that we're going to hear a little bit more about tonight. And which was really, really nice was that she came across with Ana Leija Barbosa, a fisherwoman herself. She was descended from the African enslaved in the Amazon region, along with indigenous communities. So she always says she was a daughter of the enslaved and of the Amazon indigenous. And she was hosted by Catherine, by Mali, by Heather and people in Skye, and taken in Dunvegan. And it was quite remarkable that across the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, across centuries of history, between the Brazilian Amazon and Europe, that at times has been one of conflict and violence, and many people in this part of the world were also involved in projects where there was dispossession in other parts of the world. But as well as that, and as well as the language barriers, it was quite remarkable that in a short space of time, thanks in great part to the kind of hospitality and the generosity of spirit here in the islands, with quite a remarkable piece of work going on, where very quickly they recognised that a lot of the challenges they faced very violently. We're talking about the attack on their houses, living under death threats, attempts on their life, and the burning of the forest. Even though those kind of conflicts hit the headlines, they recognised that in Scotland, for example, there were histories of dispossession, that people felt really strongly about the land, and that there's been tears shed, that there's been a deep sense of belonging, that there's traditions and cultures in the islands that throughout a lot of stages, different stages of what's been called development or improvement, modernisation, through all of these things, there's still this remarkable sense of community and determination, that people who are proud of where they came from, proud of their roots, can stand together and have the kind of discussions that we had with each other that weren't just about what's happening in the Amazon, what's happening in Scotland, but the direction this world is going. So there's also many concerns about the state of the environment and the future that's facing for children. We see quite a few children here. I suppose as a researcher, I work at the University of Strathclyde, and I'm lucky to be joined here by other researchers from Germany, for example, many from Brazil, who are also committed to thinking about, well, what's our role then? We're employed by public institutions, taxpayers pay our money, we're working in institutions that should really be working hard to address some of the deep set environmental, economic and social challenges, and it's not always evident that we're doing that job very successfully. And I'd argue we can't really do it unless we're connected really strongly in a very profound way to people who are dealing with some of these issues on a day-to-day basis, and that may be around land rights. It might be about thinking, where on earth are our children going to grow up? Is there going to be a factor, are they going to be able to stay on the island? Is there something for them to do? Is there going to be a house that they can live in that's affordable? All these issues. And what was really, really strong, we met again last week. Maria Leosa was over in Glasgow. She has got another reason to be back in Brazil. There's a huge demonstration taking place in the capital right now. One of the big things that came from that discussion was that, look, it's not a question of some people's struggles are small and ours in the Amazon is very big. But there are common things that link us as human beings. There are ways that we have to kind of recreate our sense of community, and in doing so, recreate who we are. And in doing that, it means we'll have to rethink our relationships with the environment. What is the future? What's this land going to do? What values are going to be of us and for us? And how can we better, I suppose, look after the land, look after each other, look after relationships that aren't just between ourselves and our families or the people here in the island or who's living in Glasgow, but in a world that's interconnected and one that's warming. We see the effects of climate change every single day, and the effects are being felt already in different parts of the globe. We're going to be seeing some evidence from the Amazon, what's happening, saying how can we, in a really sincere way, try and make connections, between ourselves at university, what's happening here in the Isle of Skye, what's happening in the Amazon. And we're trying to do this. Last year was a big visit to Skye. It's been a few years we've been developing these relationships, and we've been doing it in very small groups up until now. And to be here, with a lot of people, coming along to hear Andy, to hear Marcella from Brazil, it's just really, really, really encouraging. And as Catherine mentioned, there's a workshop tomorrow. We're hoping people will come. It's going to be facilitated, bringing art into how we talk about these things. And we're just hoping, some of you will have time tomorrow evening to come along and talk about, from the perspective of people here in Skye, sharing the experience from the Amazon, how we can continue to take some steps forward to address some of the things that concern us as individuals and as communities. So thanks very much for turning up. I think we've been asked to introduce our speakers. Andy Whiteman, I think that name will be familiar to most people in the room. The name's certainly familiar to anybody that's doing research with us, because his books are some of the first material that's handed to them. Andy, when they come into our department, we're lucky to have Lynn and other researchers be anchored from our university here, and they'll be familiar with your books and see other people in the audience with them. But a name maybe less familiar to you is Marcella Vecchione from the University of Para. Marcella is here. Also her second visit to Scotland, just after the visit to Skye last year. Marcella made time to come over and spend some time with us in the university. This is her first time to the Isle of Skye. It's a great honour to have her presenting here. She's one of the leading researchers looking at some of the conflicts taking place in the Amazon, and looking at the rights of Indigenous people, traditional communities, the fishing communities there that continue to lose access to land on which their lives depend. I think it's important to say that when she was here last year, she made it her business to continue with her commitments and come and visit us and speak with us at a very difficult time. It's almost a year now that Bruno Pereira and Don Phillips were killed in the Amazon. Don Phillips was a Guardian journalist, and so that meant that particular death, made the news here, even though there's been hundreds of people killed in that state for years. So Don Phillips' murder and the brutality of it was carried in the news here and gave us some idea of the violence that many people have been facing day in and day out. Alongside him was Bruno Pereira, who was an activist, and because the government at that time was refusing to honour its commitments to traditional communities, people like him were going deeper and deeper into the Amazon, taking great risks, and to insist, for example, that Indigenous territories would be demarcated and the rights and the health of those populations would be respected. As a result of that, he was killed. And his funeral happened to take place at the same day when we were having an event in the University of Strathclyde. And I said this morning, and I hope it's okay to say it again today, Marcella, who was very, very close to him. Marcella's the godmother of his eldest daughter, so she was looking after those children when Don Phillips' wife was looking for him, trying to find his remains deep into the Amazon, again because the police and the state refused to do their duty. So it kind of blew me away that in the midst of this, and she participated in the funeral online, and then came back that afternoon to talk further about why that death should not be in vain, and why the struggles of the Indigenous peoples and others in the Amazon that continue day to day, like our friends that were just with us and were with us in Skye, going back to a violent situation, they're determined to persist, and the way in which they do it, and not just their determination but also the humour and the generosity of spirit that I've talked about, continue to be a huge inspiration. And so the fact that Marcella's back with us again today and sharing her own thoughts on this with a large audience here in Skye is just really, really gratifying. And personally, I think it's really, really important. And I really hope that everyone here gets something from it. So really, thanks very much for your respect and for turning up and for participating in tonight. And hope to see you again tomorrow evening. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be with you tonight. I just travelled up from Roybridge today. My mother lives in Penafeeler, so I'm going to stay with her tonight, and then I need to be down the road for a dental appointment in Fort William tomorrow. So it's literally a flying visit. I'm an author and activist, been working on land issues for 20, 30 years. And what I want to do tonight is just give a kind of brief overview of the land issue, and more importantly, how we need to tackle it, because I think often the debates that characterise land generate more heat than light. And it's also important to deal with some of the structural issues around land, which are not easy to deal with, take quite a bit of hard work, take quite a bit of time, and moreover, take a lot of political commitment, which is not in great supply on this topic. I first got involved in land issues when I was when I left school. I went tree planting above Aberfeldy, and the first thing I had to do was to cut down a lot of the birks of Aberfeldy and put them in a big pile and put a tyre on top, fill it with diesel and set it alight. And we were clearing the indigenous forest to plant commercial softwoods on behalf of the Middleton Bank. And it was a very violent enterprise, and I got interested in trees, and I went to University of Aberdeen to study forestry. And whilst I was there, a huge controversy blew up over planting commercial crops of softwoods in the so-called flow country in the far north of Scotland, in Caithness and Sutherland, in the 1980s. And the Royal Society for Protection of Birds were very exercised about this, because these were deep, deep peatlands, very valuable habitat for some birds. But I was exercised about the red shanks and the green shanks, but I was also curious as to why, if we wanted to plant trees there, and self-evidently we should not have, we're now paying millions to rip them all out. But if we did want to, why should we give tax breaks to people in London to do it? Because that's what we were doing. There were kind of sports stars and various celebrities were avoiding tax by buying land in the far north. And that's what got interested me in the land question, because when the chief executive of the company that was doing all this came to give us a lecture, I asked them that question. Would it not be better giving this money that you're foregoing in tax to the landowners and the farmers and the crofters in Caithness, and they could plant the trees? That would be a bit more logical. I don't remember the answer, but my professor took me aside afterwards and said that he didn't think it was a good idea to ask questions like that. So naturally, I've kept on asking those kinds of questions, because it's evident that when you deal with land and power, you're dealing with quite a sensitive topic. You're dealing with a topic in which there are quite powerful vested interests at play, and you're dealing with a topic that really needs properly understood if you're going to be able to try and tackle it. So, the land issue comes down to three broad topics. The first is the question of land tenure. That's the rules by which people own and occupy land, whether as owners or tenants. And those rules are the product of centuries of decisions by men, because until the early 20th century it was men who made the law, and it was only men who owned property who owned the law. Britain never had a revolution. And so it's important to understand that the legacy we're dealing with is a male property legacy. And it wasn't until the 20th century women got the vote, but as I'll hint at later, women still don't have the legal right to inherit land. So we're dealing with some profound assumptions about the rules of land tenure, which have been in place for a long, long time, but are, at the end of the day, social constructs which we, if we so wish, can change through amending legislation in the Scottish Parliament. All of this stuff is fully devolved. So it's about land tenure. It's also about ownership. It's about the question of who actually owns the land, how much do they own, and what are the rules governing all of that. And finally, of course, it is also about how people use the land. And when you get to the point of conflict about land use, it's often easy to see it just as a conflict between different perceptions, different views, different visions, different outlooks on how a particular piece of land should be used. But sitting underneath that is a whole structure of power that needs to be understood and needs to be reformed if we're going to avoid conflict in future. And to that extent, land is about power, fundamentally about power. It's about the nature of power, it's about how power is derived, it's about how it's distributed, and it's about how it's exercised. And I like a quote from the late Labour politician Tony Benn, who, in a debate, I think about Britain's signature of signing up to the Maastricht Treaty in the House of Commons, he asked his famous 5 questions. And he put these questions, as he said it, to anybody who claims to have power. And these are the 5 questions. What power do you have? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And finally, he said, and if you can't answer this question, you don't live in a democracy. How can we get rid of you? And those 5 questions have basically guided much of my work on land, and I would suggest is a very, very useful template to look at any conflict or any set of power relations, to understand exactly what's going on, who has power, who doesn't, where they got it from, and whose interest they're exercising, etc. Because only when you tackle those root questions do you have significant change. And so that, in my view, is the framework within which we need to look at land relations in Scotland. The whole question of how land is owned and used is, as I say, it's a social construct. It's a make-up thing. There's nothing inherent, there's nothing hardwired about the current system. We can change the current system. The current system was made up. The current system is a product of centuries of feudal history. It was all made up. And the question is, what do we want to make up now, and how do we want to get there? And that's why, in addition to understanding questions of power, it's really important to understand our own history and how we got here. Because this is about the laws we made and are making. It is about economic forces which continue to impose themselves upon us. And it's about politics. And so, for example, I used to take field trips in the 1990s around Scotland looking at land use. And students would ask, why are there no trees on all the farms, or very, very few trees? And I remember having an academic with me who had some kind of fancy social science lesson to all this about farmers and how they didn't like trees. It's much, much more fundamental about that. Until about 1970, 1980, 2/3 of Scotland's agricultural land, more than that in fact, almost 3/4, was tenanted, either by farming tenants or by crofters. And in law, farming tenants and crofters had no legal right to trees. Never did. Well, they did a long time ago, but not in the modern era. And not until 2000 and something did crofters get the right to plant trees and own them, and not until 2003 did tenant farmers. So the simple answer as to why there's no farm forestry in Scotland like you find in continental Europe is fundamentally a question of the laws we made that said that landowners own trees. It's not some fancy social science thing. It's fundamentally rooted in the laws we have. Why are there very few women who own land in Scotland? Because until 1964 we had primogeniture. The eldest male son shall inherit. Your local estate here, Dunvegan, was an entailed estate. In the 19th century, the law of entail was passed. The law of entail allows you to project the inheritance of a piece of land and make it immune from creditors. So Dunvegan estate was entailed to male successors. Many, many women could have owned Dunvegan, but they didn't. And if there wasn't a male successor, it would be the daughter of the latest male, which is why Dame Flora got a look in. And even to this day, as I say, children do not have the legal right to inherit land, unlike most of continental Europe. And that disadvantages mainly women, because usually sons don't have much of a problem in being able to inherit land. It's one of the reasons, for example, we have a very large-scale pattern of ownership. If you start with feudal grants from Robert the Bruce, and you hand these down to the eldest male son, you're not going to get much change in the pattern of land ownership. And as I say, Britain didn't have a revolution. Now, the French Revolution and its aftermath, the French Revolution in particular, swept away the power of the crown, swept away the power of the church. Two huge, powerful institutions that maintained a feudal theocracy in France. And so the communes in France, the local municipalities, own 1/3 of the public forests in France. Individuals in France can inherit land. It's why you've got a very small-scale pattern of land ownership. It's taken 200 years to develop. Other European countries are similar. Britain is the odd one out because we've never had a revolution, and until 1997, we still had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mainly male hereditary landowners in our upper chamber of the House of Parliament, which is a weird state of affairs. There's still 92 of them, and they have their own little by-elections when one dies, which is fascinating to follow. So, to my mind, to be able to deal with the land question, whatever guise it creeps up on you, whether it's to do with fishing rights, whether it's to do with crofting, whether it's to do with housing, whether it's to do with water, whether it's to do with hunting, whether it's to do with minerals, whether it's to do with any number of things, are all tied to questions about how land is owned and who owns it. And hence the question of land governance is fundamental. And that should really be the goal of land reform. Who decides? Who has the power to make decisions about how land is owned? Who has the power to make decisions about who shall own it? Who has the power to make decisions about how it shall be used? And fundamentally, all of those questions need to be democratised far, far more than they are at the moment. And we've made some small steps in that direction, but they really are baby steps. So, for example, we've given constituted community bodies some rights to buy land. But who decides whether they get the right to buy the land? It's a minister in Edinburgh, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. It's not your local council. In fact, you don't have a local council on Skye. You did until 96. You have Skye and Lachlan District Council. But now you have a council that is hundreds and hundreds of miles away as well, in Inverness. And so who should make these decisions is a fundamental question, because the more power is centralised, the less able it is to reflect the aspirations and the views of local people. And one example of that in the last year or two has been the rise of the market in carbon speculation, the so-called green lairds, a term I don't like because it conflates green, which is broadly speaking a word with positive connotations, with lairds, which is broadly speaking a word with negative connotations. But never mind, we're talking about a new gold rush. And we've had these in the past. This is nothing new, okay? I mean, in the past we've had waves of land speculation, because remember, Scotland is an unregulated land market. Anybody from anywhere in the world can come and buy as much land as they like here, as long, of course, it's for sale. No questions are asked. I remember at the launch, the handing over ceremony of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust back in 1992, I was speaking to a local Aigach who said he was bemused that it had come to this, that they needed to do such a dramatic step as own their own island. But he understood why. He understood it fundamentally. It was down to the fact that the land market was totally unregulated. And he told me he just borrowed, maybe I can't remember the details, £100, let's say, to buy a washing machine on hire purchase. And he needed to fill out 4 pages of detail about himself and his finances to get a washing machine for £100. And yet, a German fire-eating artist was able to go to a land agent in Bermuda and buy the whole of the island of Egg without anybody ever, even knowing it was happening, never mind asking any questions. And so that means that when new markets emerge, or new values emerge on land, like, for example, windmills up the hill there, were on land that historically was regarded as very poor quality and low value. One of the criticisms of my own work and my own expose of the fact that so few people in Scotland own land is to say, but it doesn't really matter that they own so much land, it's all very poor quality. Well, what about when wind starts having a high market value? Or what about now when carbon starts having a high market value. These things happen, these ebbs and flows happen. And so what's happening right now is, because we have an unregulated market in land, all sorts of weird and wonderful people are emerging from the City of London to pour money into the Scottish land market through all sorts of opaque structures to speculate in something called carbon credits, which in and of themselves are a complete and utter nonsense. They should have no place in climate policy, because every carbon credit that is bought by a polluting industry, by planting trees, for example, is a ton of carbon, yes, being sequestered by woodland, but which is not contributing anything to cooling the planet because it's been bought by some polluting industry. And yet we're allowing this market to emerge without any critical questioning as to its value in climate policy. And to my mind, that is the fundamental question. What is its role in cooling the planet? And we know from the science that we could afforest all of the world if we wanted to. We couldn't, but if we did, it would have minimal impact on our trajectory of global warming. For the simple reason that it'll take decades for the levels of sequestration anticipated ever to be realised from the capture by nature of carbon. And yet we need to, as the latest IPCC assessment said, we need deep and immediate cuts in emissions. And so what carbon credits are, what the carbon market is just a license to some fairly unscrupulous individuals in the City of London and in business and industry to avoid their moral and increasingly legal obligations to cut their emissions. Now, and the impact on the Scottish land market is a symptom of that. It's a symptom of a failure to properly formulate a climate policy that's designed to cool the planet and cut emissions. And so finally, I return to the theme I mentioned earlier on. This is fundamentally about democratisation. It's fundamentally about giving people like you who live here as much of a say as possible in the land that you live in and around. The starting point should be that we make decisions about the ownership and use of land in the place where the people and the land are. Some decisions should be made further away on a regional basis. Some decisions should be made on a national basis. And yes, other decisions should also be made on an international basis. But that's not the way we have it. We have decisions being made far, far away from where people live and work. And we're seeing that increasingly in flawed delivery of policies like highly protected marine areas. They didn't come out of the blue. The idea of having no-take zones is a good one. It's a scientifically proven method of recovering seas. But you don't just throw that at communities in isolation. You have a plan, a long-term plan, of which that may or may not be a part today, tomorrow, or in 5 years' time, depending on the outcome of a properly inclusive process. But that's not where we're at. We're at a bunch of performing politicians in Edinburgh who want to claim credit for various policies they dream up and who are increasingly imposing it on the people rather than working through with the people. And one of the reasons they can get away with that is because there is no real democracy below the level of Edinburgh. Highland Council, we only have 32 councils. Finland is a country of 6 or 7 million people. It's got 330 municipalities. They have powers over about half the tax spent locally. They have land use decision-making powers. They're really powerful entities. If you walk down the street in a Norwegian town, you will meet people who are making decisions about half of your income tax. Right? And you meet them. You meet them at the school gates, you meet them in the shop, you meet them at the shinty match. Well, they don't play shinty in Norway, but football match on a Saturday. So the level of accountability for decisions being made about how your taxes are spent, how land is used, are much, much more fundamental, much, much more local, and much, much more relevant to people's lived experience in most of mainland Europe. Whereas your local council is in Inverness, which is a scandal, and even then, it doesn't have virtually any meaningful powers. Edinburgh can even tell it how much council tax to set, even though it's not the responsibility of Edinburgh to set council tax. So fundamentally, we need to rebuild our local democratic architecture to deal with land reform. If we don't do that, we're increasingly going to get solutions imposed centrally, managed centrally, which may have a few little benefits on the side, but ultimately are not going to deal with the deep-seated structural problems we have in the ownership and use of land. Thank you.
But what I really hope is that the things that I'm going to be talking about here can resonate with your stories and your struggles here and your problems here as well. So, as I introduce the theme here, you're going to see a video. It's a drone video that I made about 3 months ago in the Amazon, in the state of Pará, which is in the eastern part of the Brazilian Amazon. And this is an area in the state of Pará that's called the Santareno Plateau, which is because we frequently think about the Amazon as a continuous forest, right? But the thing is that the Amazon is very diverse within it. So you have a variety of biomes, even inside the Amazon. So you have the rainforest, you have the savannas, you have transition areas, ecotones, and these all brings the diversity and the richness in terms of biodiversity that you have in the area. But one thing that's very important to stress is that this biodiversity is very much linked and connected to the way people live there, work in the land, and especially the way they work the land collectively, the way they occupy the land collectively, the way they care for the land collectively. So the biodiversity we have there is actually a social biodiversity that would never exist if people were not there, working there, laboring the land as they are laboring. But then, when you look to an image like that, as I was saying, it's in a plateau area that's in the city of Santarém in western Pará, which is one of the areas where soy plantations are really expanding onto. You can see that even with all this diversity in the forest, what we see is that the monocrop intervention, the plantations, pretty much like in the 16th and the 17th century, it is reproducing itself in a global structure of power, of division of labor, and of continuous appropriation and expropriation of people and of their labor in this area, as if people there and their work there, they worth less than they work and the people in other areas of the globe. So this area, you can see that there is these small islands of green areas, of forests, right? And all these brownish areas in the video, they are, as I was saying, for soy plantations, right? But what is happening most recently in the Amazon, I would say in the last 12 years, it's a kind of a very specific zoning and planning for the territory. But as a matter of fact, zoning and planning for that territory, as I was saying, it has been going on since the 16th and the 17th century. But what we see now is a kind of zoning and planning connected to the monocrop expansion in the area that, of course, brings violence back in a very violent way, but it's also related to the green economy. And why is that? The most recent environmental code in Brazil that was approved in 2012, in this code, there is a thing that's called the Rural Environmental Registry. And then you can think what it has to do with Europe or North America or the rest of the world. It has everything to do. And why? Because for trading the soy that is in this area, you have to have this registry. And this registry is what is going to conform that the soy or the corn or the beef that's coming from a specific area doesn't come from an area that was degraded or that had suffered deforestation. But what happened after this code was approved in 2012 was not the diminishing in deforestation levels. Quite the contrary, we had an increase on it. And why is that? Because people that was already expanding onto collective territories that were not already homologated, registered as a collective territory. So there were no papers. There was no land title for them. So people, they were advancing on these lands and they were registering this land online. Everything is online. Everything is electronic. As if it were their land according to the norms in the environmental code. And then the justification that they will use is that we can do that because the code allows for 20% of land use in this area, for any land use. It allows to have 20%, for example, for soy plantations, for corn plantations, for cattle. But let's remember what I just said before. It doesn't mean that this area is a registered area for the people that are advancing on the land. So in that sense, deforestation is a sign of occupation. And then for people using the very environmental registry to register the land as theirs in the future. So the greening activity of the economy and of the soy plantations is actually allowing people to consolidate their occupation and to make their illegal occupation as legal occupation, right? And this is very connected to the expansion of their economic activity. But it's not just that. What they are also doing, so all these green areas, they are part of this 20% that I was just talking about, which are called legal reserves in a property, right? So they are also using all these legal reserves to create carbon credits to compensate for other activities that the same owner has in other areas that do not have the 20% that they have to have so that they can export legally the soybean or the corn or the beef. So it's greenwashing, obviously, but it's much more than that. It is a way of legalizing illegal occupation. It is a way of expanding a private property rationale and logic over territories which the logic of using the land is not that. And it's also a way of expelling brutally, but in a very silent way, people that are here. Saying that the kind of agriculture, the kind of activity that they deploy on these lands are not a fixed, a good, a structured, and a profitable agriculture. So why they do not just get out of the land, or why do they not just get integrated to the soy chain or to the beef chain? That's going to be much more profitable to them. But what they sometimes forget, and in this image you can see that, maybe not very well because of the light, but what is in here, it's smallholder farmers agriculture, right? So people are practicing agroecology, collective farming, in this, you remember the other image, right? So these, the other images are surrounding this place. This place is a women smallhold farming led territory in where they are collectively practicing agriculture. No herbicides, no pesticides, lots of varieties, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and they are trading it in local fairs in a logic of short economic circuits. So they are really braving the other activity that are surrounding them. And again, an activity that's very violent because, for example, when you have soybeans plantations, like in the other image, you have this soy is all GMO, all genetic modified organisms, all. It demands the use of lots of pesticides and herbicides, very hardcore ones, Roundup, 24D. Everything that's prohibited in Europe is allowed there, right? And with that, they don't have bees anymore, so they don't have the variety in crops that they used to have anymore. And this is also a way of expelling people and displacing people from their territories. But even though they keep on the place, they keep on working collectively because they recognize if they get out, then it's going to be the end. They are the only source. So these women, indigenous peoples like Maria Leusa that was here last year and this year as well, these people are the people that are really standing on the ground, literally. And when I say standing on the ground, it's just, as Andy was saying before as well, it's not just a matter of standing on the ground in terms of defending the land per se as the material part. So it's not just a dispute over land, it's a dispute ultimately on the ways you use land, the ways you dwell land, the ways you live in land, the way you build and assemble land collectively. But the logic they apply to build, to dwell, to live this land collectively, to produce, because it's also production, but it's a production connected to the social reproduction of life, not of death. Because when you see the images there, here you see the women there, right? They were working here at the vegetable plots, right? They are planting, seedling, then you see agroforest back there. In the other images, you don't see life. You don't see people. You don't see variety, right? You just see islands of green that is used to compensate the projects of death that are surrounding the areas of collective life. So, what is that green economy? What are you compensating for, right? In the end of the day, because it's actually not, it's not diminishing carbon emissions. It's not going to take to a cool planet, but mostly it's not going to make the lives of the people that are building these forests collectively, that are building these really green and varied and diversified areas collectively. Much to the contrary, it's going to take them out of there. It's going to kill them. And if they're killed, there will be no more forest. There will be no more diversity, right? It's like that in the Amazon, and it's like that in many other collectively occupied areas, right? The diversity you have, again, I want to stress that, is social biodiversity, right? For the Amazon, it's being corroborated now, actually in the last 10 years, many archaeological research and interdisciplinary research showing that the Amazon rainforest, so all the Pan-Amazon region, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, all the rainforests that you have in these 9 countries that build together what we call the Pan-Amazon region, it was a forest that was a cultivated forest. For 13,000 years, 13,000 years. So it's not that the rainforest just dropped from the meteor all of the sudden, right? The forest is the result of the collective labor of people living and working the forest. But when you work the forest or the land in a logic that's not the private property logic, so that's a problem. So you cannot recognize it even as a place, and you cannot recognize the people that are there as people, again, that are working and laboring the land, and that have a value on their own because of it. Because these are the ones that are imprinting the value on the land. It's not the soil, it's not the corn, it's not the beef. It's the people that are working there and that are imprinting this value on the land, right? But these images of hope, why it's so important to look at them in the end, but also to remember the images that you were looking at in the beginning, right? These images of hope, you see all the diversity, agroforestry, the women working, saving seeds. They are really threatened by the model of soy plantations, corn plantations, and beef, and mining, and everything that is homogenizing the space in the forest. So can you imagine you have a rainforest, which is the most biodiverse biome in the world, it is being homogenized. The landscape is being homogenized. That's crazy and violent. Crazy and violent because we are putting the future of the people that are there in jeopardy, and this is already a problem per se, but you are also putting the future of many other people around the world. Brian was talking about the children, right? In jeopardy as well, because these spaces, this work, this labor, it's really key to keep the ecological balance in the world. But when I'm saying that, it's not to justify what these people, many people want to make, many politicians all over the world, not just in Brazil, want to make out of these people. Because what people are trying to do to keep their rights in the ground as a solution now, which is connected to the green economy, is to turn them into environmental services workers. So it's not their cultural value, it's not their collective work, it's not their collective territories, it's the environmental services they can provide. So again, we go back to an alienation scheme that separates people from nature, society from nature, and we continue on reproducing the same model that is just destroying our spaces, our environment all over the world. So when I was today walking through the crofts here and learning about the history in the island of Skye, of course it's very different, but there is a thing that's very similar. It's like the way people live in their land is the way they are working and laboring and collectively building this land is what makes this land what it is. So this should be per se a need of protecting this land and protecting the rights of people that are in this land, because again, that's a way of keeping things in balance, right? And you see they're waiting for you there. And not as environmental services providers, right? But just because who they are and the rights they have, that should be recognized, again, per se and in a very grounded way, as these people there are fighting for. But again, it's a huge challenge, and I think the green economy scheme is, I totally agree with Andy, is really a huge challenge for us, because it's related to a global structure of reproducing the same problems that we had already, and not solving anything. So just to end, I'm going to give you an example, which is more related to the European Union level, but I think we can resonate with that. So the European Union just approved the EU deforestation law, right? So it's going to the trilogue to being finally approved, and in this legislation, they are discussing rules to avoid the importing of 6 different commodities, mainly from tropical areas, right? Cocoa, rubber, timber, soy, palm oil, and beef. So these are the 6 commodities that they are discussing to avoid deforestation. But in the legislation, there is no talk, for example, about other biomes rather than the Amazon. Do you remember that when I said that the Amazon rainforest is not just the Amazon biome? You have other biomes there. I do not know how many of you met Maria Leusa when she was here last year. So for example, Maria Leusa is in the Amazon, but the area Maria Leusa is not Amazon biome. It's a transition area between the Amazon and the Cerrado, which is the savanna, which is the area where you have most of the soy monocrop plantations in the country. It's not in the legislation. It's not in the legislation. So you really try to do something to resonate with people's affects and the affections they have for the forest. And you just forget about the other areas that have a connection with the forest also, in ecological and biological terms, but also in relation to the people that are transiting, again, dwelling, keeping their agriculture going on, much related to this variety. That for planting soy, just one crop, GMO, you need a lot of herbicides and pesticides so that you can have 3 different harvesting moments, 3 different harvest moments for the soy crop. You're gonna need a lot of pesticides and herbicides. These degrade the environment, impoverish the soil brutally, and kill people. Kill people. Make people very, very, very ill. In the midterm and in the long term. Nothing about it at the legislation, right? So I'm sorry to be talking about it because I know it's hard, but I think it's also a way of touching people and bringing some affections, our affects, our feelings, our thinking the earth and the planet and the environment, so that we can think about how different struggles to protect land and territories collectively can also bring us to a momentum, to a possibility, to an opportunity to discuss strategies, right? To collectively protect and decide about our future. This thing that Andy was talking about is key, democracy. But let's also think about a radical democracy. A democracy that's not just fight for in parliament and in official cabinets, which is also important to occupy, but also a democracy that's fought for on the ground. People that usually do not have representation in any parliament, but are fighting for a very radical democracy based on social difference, based on protecting territories, protecting life, and ultimately deciding about our own future. So why don't you think about opportunities and strategies collectively to decide about our future globally, based on local challenges and also local struggles. And why not? Local, social, and democratic innovations to, again, protect our future, protect our territories for the future, and for our lives.
To what extent are community buyouts the solution? And if they are the solution, what's preventing the whole of Scotland from being bought out by local communities? And while we're at it, how can we, in one place, support those who are campaigning for such localization of power in a completely different part of the world that we don't necessarily understand, far less participate in on a daily basis?
Well, thank you. I think the question are community buyouts, the answer really depends on what your question is. The answer to what? I related the story of the Isle of Egg, and if the Isle of Egg, if the council had owned the pier, if everyone had security of tenure, which they didn't, they were getting evicted, if folk owned their own homes, if there were 25 farms on the island, if there was a diversity of ownership and occupation, there wouldn't be the potential for anyone to come and buy the whole island. And no one would suggest that they all pool it and own it collectively, right? So much of the impetus for community buyouts has arisen because we've got a structural failing in the land market. So instead of dealing with the land market, right, we tell communities, well, you buy it. Now, I'm not saying it's not the answer, it is the answer. We do need much more communal ownership of land and property. But the way it's been developed has got two big problems. One is it's very legalistic and bureaucratic. It's threefold, really. Two, it freezes out anyone who's not a community organisation. So what about a local business? I was in Mull recently. There's an oyster farmer there, right? Their neighbour has just blocked access to the foreshore by a means which is probably legal, but maybe not. There's no way he can afford to take this guy to court, and a business that's been operating in Mull for 25 years is threatened with closure. Now, land reform should do something for him, because it's small businesses that generate a lot of the jobs. Whereas land reform's doing nothing for social enterprises, for local businesses, for local people. It's just doing something for these kind of structures that you've got to build. So I'm not saying they're not the answer. They are part of the answer, but they're certainly not the whole answer. And then the third problem is that politicians have invested nearly all their aspirations on this. You speak to any politician in Holyrood about land reform, and they'll very quickly tell you about a community buyout in their constituency. They won't tell you about reforming inheritance law. They won't tell you about local councils being able to take ownership of the foreshore from the Crown. They won't talk about democratisation of land use decision making. They won't talk about the £2 billion nature finance project being run by Scottish Natural Heritage with three City of London corporations. They won't talk about all those things. They talk about the easy thing, which, look at these nice people, owning this land isn't all this wonderful. So that's the third problem with it, is it avoids engagement with some quite serious and difficult problems. So, yeah, it's the answer to something, but it's not the answer to everything. No. Well, the second one, how are these markets impacting the crofting community? As far as I'm aware, they're not yet. But this is the problem. These markets, these new financial instruments, emerge from the City of London. And remember, government parrots a figure of a £20 billion finance gap. This is the gap between what's committed to public expenditure to restore nature and what's actually needed. Where does that 20 billion come from? It comes from an organisation called the Green Finance Institute. Who are the Green Finance Institute? They're a wholly owned research group, wholly owned by the City of London Corporation. So as Tony Benn would say, what power do they have? In whose interest are they exercising it? What they want is new routes to financialise land. So of course they're going to pluck big figures out the air. And it's the duty of government and politicians not to accept those figures, but to scrutinise them, okay? But what's happening is that these markets and this financialisation is emerging because it's free to do so. By the time it has an impact on crofters or anybody else, it'll be too late to do anything about it. So we need more democracy so that people on Skye decide about how much of Skye they're willing the carbon sequestration potential of to be offset for airlines in America or whatever, yeah? And B, you need to place sufficient constraints in the way of these new initiatives to be able to regulate them, instead of just like roll over and accept it, as is happening just now. What was your first question?
The first question?
Yeah.
Yeah, the first question is about...
Well, the community power.
What?
About the community power.
Community power and if association to unions, movements, how can help to increase the community power? Well,
fundamentally, I mean, if you look at the history of Scotland, we actually used to have more democracy in the 15th century than we do now, arguably. It's bizarre. But I mean, the whole history of Scotland is a history of our local administrations being neutered, basically. Okay, I mean, we used to have 196 town councils. I was in Tobermory, my daughter's a musician, and I was acting as a roadie. We were in Tobermory for a gig the other night. And Tobermory Town Hall is there still, but it's occupied by Virgin money. Now, you go to any Europe, you go to Germany or Italy or France, you go to a town like Tobermory, and it'll have a town hall, and in that town hall will be locally elected people running the affairs of the town. We don't have that anymore. We've hollowed out our local democracy that we used to have, okay? Now, you cannot replace that by voluntary community effort. You can do quite a lot to mitigate it, but you can't replace it. Like your local community development trust, your local community landowners do not have the power to raise tax. They do not have the power to pass laws. They don't have executive authority to allocate land. Right? These are the real powers that people need. The only powers they have, if they're community landowners, are the powers of landowners, because that's what they are. And though those are quite substantial, and you can use them to positive effect, absolutely you can. But you can only go so far without political and economic decision making in your community. So it's a political project. I mean, people have to want it. If they don't want it, it's not going to happen. Even when they do want it, it might not happen. But if there was a bigger movement for local democracy right across the sweep of public policy and transport and health and the environment, land use and all the rest of it, if there was a popular movement for that, it would be delivered. But there isn't. I don't know why there isn't. I think it is because we're facing so many challenges that it tends to be easier and it tends to be perceived to be a more efficient use of our resources to try and tackle the immediate problems in front of us, which are usually the symptoms of a much deeper problem. And so we get worn out. And we generally give up. And then someone picks up again and we try again. But until we get a popular movement for more real decision making, then we're always just going to be battling the latest issue that confronts us without the tools to actually deal with it. All I would say is, I mean, democracy is not easy. Difficult everywhere. And the idea that it's a common refrain from politicians that they say, well, this community or this institution does not have the capacity to deal with these powers, therefore we'll keep them. Well, that's wrong. I mean, social communities have got infinite capacity if they're given responsibility. And sure, there'll be divisions, there'll be disagreements, but that's why you have rules and processes to work through issues, to reach a consensus or a decision at the end of the day. And there'll always be people who are unhappy with decisions. The acid test is, are the people who are unhappy willing to just accept it and live another day, because they realise that they've lost it, Or is there a fundamental flaw in the system which means they've actually been disenfranchised? And increasingly, it's the latter. We are disenfranchised. We are not, in any meaningful way, party to any of the decisions that affect the land around us. Somebody else is.
Well, we're coming back to that negative word that deals again, layers. There are so many layers of legalese, so many barriers for people to jump through when they try and get something done.
Yeah, sure. But those, but arguably there should be. I mean,
what owning your own property gave you was a feeling that somehow that you'd crossed the Rubicon and you got onto the side where things were easy until interest rates went up to 15%. So that's one of the, maybe a further reflection on why democracy is being sidelined, because it's gotten so difficult for individuals.
There's no alternative to democracy. There's no alternative to people collectively making strategic decisions about the place they live in. No alternative, in my view. I mean, I'll deal with the immediate one. I mean, the answer is we continually need to adapt. Okay, I mean, crofting legislation was a product of its time. It's no longer completely fit for today. It needs to adapt. It hasn't adapted, it's got more complicated. And key reforms that should have been done 20 years ago still haven't been done. So, I mean, the answer is adaptation. Things change, the world changes, the demands of markets change, uses of land change, and we all just need to adapt. I mean, that may be a glib answer, but to the extent that Grayson's committee have rights, then they need to choose themselves as a political organisation with the Crofters Union. Do we fight for those rights? Do we fight for modified rights? I mean, it's great that Crofters have rights. I mean, one of the few land occupiers in Scotland that do have very profound rights. So yeah, it's really up to the crofting community how it wants to take that forward. I mean, it's not for me or anyone else to say, but I mean, the market for sheep, the market for cattle, the market for timber, the market for all these commodities over the past 100 years has fluctuated. So you can't have an economy that's based on a narrow range of marketable products, especially if you're very, very far away from markets. You do need to diversify, and that's the key. I mean, I don't understand. For example, the government wants to plant lots and lots of trees, wants to plant 18,000 hectares every year. And it's relying mainly on private money from the City of London to do it. But why don't we have crowd-funded forests? Like, I've got an investment in Loch Broom hydropower. I've got an investment in Applejuice in Applecross. I've got an investment in Lochaber Power. These are all community share companies who've started renewable energy projects. And I've got 500 or £1,000 in each, and I get a 3% return, and I can get my money out if I want after 4 years. We could do the same with all the people of Scotland. We could raise literally millions if we wanted to. So the answer is actually in our hands. We don't have to roll back and just accept that those from the City of London with lots of money are the only people who can invest in the future of Scotland's land. We can adapt the sheep farming economy, we can adapt the forest economy, we can adapt the land economy any way we like. We actually do have the power to do it. We're just not very imaginative about it. What you need to do is you need to give genuine political power back to communities so that before even anyone starts doing any kind of rewilding, they need the consent of a local authority. They need a licence. They need a planning consent. You see, tomorrow Humza Yousaf's going to stand up, and it's reported he's going to give local authorities the power to levy a double council tax on holiday homes. That won't make a blind bit of difference. Okay? The prices will come down a little bit. That's what happens if you have to pay twice the amount of tax every year. You don't pay so much for the property. And there's plenty of people wealthy enough to be able to pay twice the council tax. Or they'll put it up as a short-term let. They might let it themselves. They'll register for non-domestic rates instead of council tax, and then they'll get the small business bonus scheme, and they'll pay no tax at all. I mean, if you really want to regulate holiday homes, for example, make it a change of use. If you want to turn your house into a hotel, or a garage, or a small fabrication yard, you're going to have to go to Highland Council and get a change of use. Might be refused. If you own a holiday house as opposed to a house that's lived in by people as their primary residence, you should also get consent. That's the way. You need to determine whether something should be happening at all at the outset. And then you can have agency in how it's done, what the benefits are. But if you have no agency at the outset, it's really, really hard to expect people to get properly engaged. And that's why, we need quite fundamental reform. Otherwise, we're always just going to be battling against the latest thing that's happening to us.
I'll try to be brief. It's a long story. My thoughts on that. I think obviously we are in a much better scenario now than we were before. There is no debate about it, right? Because we had the fascists governing the country for years, and not just him. It's important to say. Many people at the National Congress as well, and these guys, they continue to be there. So that's one of the parts of exercising democracy in the country right now, because of course we have a better president, and not just that, not just the better president. We had a very interesting moment of retaking democracy in the country, right? So people, they went to the streets, people, they really reflect about what democracy is, what the elections mean, that the elections are not just a procedure, right? Elections, they mean something in terms of change, right? About how do you want to be governed and participate in this government system, so to speak. So I think it was very profound in the country, but at the same time, in official terms, we have this configuration of still have a majority in the Congress that is very right-wing, is at the rural caucus, right? We call it the ruralist caucus in the country, that are really like big landowners, and that was a huge shift that we had in the country about 8 years ago. These people, they don't have their representatives anymore in the country. They self-represent themselves, right? So the big landowner will be the representative per se, right? It's not about lobbying anymore. So that really changed it. But there is the other side of the story, which is in the last years, we saw in Brazil a real emergency of grassroots social movements, but mostly indigenous movements and traditional communities movements that really take part on the story of democracy, right? So they again, as the rural caucus, right? They really didn't want to have representatives anymore. They want to represent themselves. So ultimately, they want to politically present themselves in the political arena, and that's what I call radical democracy in that sense, because you have political subjects that were not even recognized as political subjects, or they were not even recognized as practicing politics, just to begin with. And their politics started to be seen as the backbone of the redemocratization in the country. So that's really radical, right? Because democratization in the country now, it's not just about how many representatives you have and how important it is. Of course it is important, but it's also about who are the people that either they are there or they are really talking to the people that are there in making decisions from one side of the story, but also territorially. So we had many experiences that were really evinced in these last years, and the Munduruku are an example of it, the Munduruku people, of self-governance in their territories, right? So then you're talking about a rooted democracy, right? Really shaping the government at the territories to begin with, and then you discuss other things. So the first thing is to discuss democracy and self-government at the territories. So for me, that's the really revolutionary thing that's happening in the country right now. And Lula, he is a very intelligent man, and I think he got it, finally. And an example, finally, right? Because he was in power for 8 years, and it was no good for these people. Not good at all. It was during his government that these things, they really expanded. Unfortunately, that's right. It happened. It's a very unfortunate thing, but that's the real thing. But I think he got it. And I think it was not just symbolic. I think it was really a shift in his inauguration when he came to the presidential palace giving hands to a black woman that worked at the peripheries of one of the biggest urban centers in Brazil and the world, which is São Paulo, and that works with recycling activities. With the biggest indigenous leader in Brazil right now, who is Raoni Metukire, right? And with children and descendants of enslaved people. So I think he got it. Finally, he got it, because there will be no democracy in this country if we don't have this social biodiversity in terms of politics as well. That's it, because there is this myth that there is no racism in Brazil. No, seriously, that we are a racial democracy. That's the expression that we have in political science in the country, that there is no racism. And that has never been true. It was just a way of trying to conciliate the brutality, the continuous brutality of colonization in the country. And finally, people got it. And people started to question it. And the president got it. So I have hope in that sense. And I think we have this space for dispute right now. And is in the space of dispute, because democracy is contentious. Democracy is about dissent. It's not about consent. The thing is what you do with dissent. Are you going to be violent and genocidal with people that don't agree with you? Or are you going to try to find a way of how to tackle things? So for me, that's it. Democracy is not about consent. Democracy is about dissent. And then you have to think creatively how to deal about it, because people are different, right? But then you cannot turn difference into inequality. For me, that's the problem. And I think we are on a way of finding out what to do about it. And that for me is very radical. And I am very hopeful about it.